The fluorescent lights inside the county courthouse flickered as though they were tired of bearing witness to so many broken stories. The air was thick with tension, filled with the muted shuffle of papers, the steady tap of shoes against linoleum floors, and the hushed whispers of people waiting for their cases to be called. Among the crowd sat a woman, poised, calm, and dignified. She was black, in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce through the noise. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing extravagant, but on her shoulders rested an air of authority that none in the room could yet recognize. Her name was Marissa Johnson, though to the world she would soon be known by another title. She had walked into that courthouse with her head held high, though life had taught her that people like her, black women in spaces of power, were often underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. She knew it. She had lived it. And on this day, she was about to feel it in a way that would shake the entire courtroom. Two officers lingered nearby, their voices low but laced with arrogance. They were laughing, smirking, and glancing in Marissa's direction. They didn't know her. They didn't bother to. To them, she was just another black woman sitting in a courthouse, someone they thought could be intimidated, someone whose presence could be reduced with a gesture or a look. Their uniforms gave them the confidence of kings, and their badges felt like shields that allowed cruelty to pass as authority. Marissa sat quietly, reviewing some notes she had tucked into a leather folder. To anyone else, she looked like a bystander, maybe a concerned family member or someone waiting for her turn to testify. But her stillness was not weakness, it was power disguised. She had learned that sometimes the loudest strength is silence, and the deepest resilience is patience. The clerk's voice called for order. A case was about to begin, and the two officers strutted across the courtroom with the swagger of men who had long confused arrogance for authority. One of them made a snide comment under his breath, loud enough for Marissa to hear, about how some people don't belong in places like this. She didn't flinch. She had heard worse her entire life. But when he leaned in closer and smirked at her, his partner following with mocking laughter, something inside the room shifted. The case began, and the two officers were called to testify. They walked toward the witness stand, but in their arrogance, they brushed past Marissa roughly. It wasn't just a bump, it was deliberate. One officer's hand came down against her shoulder, a dismissive slap as though she were in the way, as though she had no right to sit where she sat. The sound echoed faintly, but its sting went far beyond skin. It was the sting of every injustice, every insult, every dismissal that black women had endured in spaces of power, dignity, and law. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Whispers rippled through the benches. For a moment, everything felt frozen in time. The audacity of what had just happened hung in the air. The officers laughed it off, straightening their uniforms, acting as if nothing had occurred. Marissa, however, did not rise in anger. She did not shout. She did not retaliate. Instead, she drew a slow, steady breath and calmly placed her folder on the bench beside her. Her eyes locked onto the officers, not with fury, but with a piercing calm that unnerved them more than rage ever could. The judge's seat at the front of the courtroom still sat empty. The presiding judge had been delayed, and the room was in a state of waiting. What no one else in that room knew was that Marissa was not there as an observer, not as a family member, and not as a powerless bystander. She was there as the judge. Her moment had come sooner than expected. The bailiff, unaware of the quiet storm that had just unfolded, stepped forward and spoke. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Johnson." The courtroom erupted in motion. Everyone stood, and in that instant, the two officers who had just slapped her, who had mocked her, who had laughed at her, turned pale. Their arrogance drained away in silence as realization dawned on their faces. The woman they had dismissed was not a powerless stranger. She was the one who would decide their fate. Marissa rose slowly, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding. Each click of her heels against the polished floor was a reminder that dignity, though often tested, cannot be erased. She ascended the steps to the bench, adjusted her robe, a robe that symbolized centuries of struggle, resilience, and triumph, and took her seat. From behind the judge's desk, Her gaze swept across the courtroom, steady and unshaken. She saw the crowd staring at her with a mix of awe and anticipation. She saw the officers avoiding her eyes, their earlier laughter now a memory they wished they could erase. And she saw, in that moment, the truth of what power really was. It was not the badge. It was not the uniform. It was not the arrogance of men who believed their authority was absolute. Power was dignity. Power was patience. Power was the quiet strength to endure insult without breaking, and then to rise higher than those who sought to pull you down. Marissa lifted her gavel and struck it once, the sound echoing through the room like thunder rolling across a stormy sky. The courtroom fell silent. "Let us proceed," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of unshakable authority. The two officers sat frozen in their seats, their arrogance replaced by fear. And for everyone else in the room, the lesson was already clear. Never underestimate the strength, dignity, and brilliance of a black woman, because sometimes the one you seek to humiliate is the very one holding your future in her hands. That day had only just begun, but already the story was being written. A story of justice, a story of pride, a story of a black woman who endured insult, only to rise higher and redefine what dignity looks like when it is tested in the harshest of ways. And the courtroom would never forget it. The silence in the courtroom after Marissa Johnson struck the gavel was unlike anything the walls had heard before. It wasn't the usual hush of order being called. It was heavier, thicker, and layered with shock and disbelief. For many in the gallery, what they had just witnessed was almost cinematic. A woman slapped by police officers had just risen to occupy the most powerful seat in the room. Marissa sat tall in her chair, her robe flowing around her like a cloak of history itself. She adjusted her glasses, her face calm but unreadable. Inside, however, her heart was steady with conviction. She had prepared her whole life for moments like this, though she never could have predicted it would arrive in this way. So raw, so revealing, so painful, and yet so powerful. The clerk, still flustered from the shock, shuffled papers and called the case again, as if reminding herself of the ordinary duties of the court. Case number 2746, People versus Carter and Daniels. Those names belonged to the two officers now sitting stiff in their seats. Officer Carter, the taller one, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful, shifted uncomfortably. Beside him, Officer Daniels, younger and more restless, fidgeted with his uniform collar. Neither dared to meet Marissa's gaze. But the courtroom had seen it. Everyone had seen it. The slap, the smirk, the arrogance, and then the revelation of who she truly was. Whispers rippled quietly across the benches. Words like karma, justice, and poetic floated through the air like sparks in a fire. Marissa leaned forward slightly, her hands resting gently on the bench. Officers Carter and Daniels, she began, her voice controlled, even measured. Before we proceed with this hearing, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. In this courtroom, there is no one above the law. Not the people sitting in the gallery, not the attorneys, and not even the officers who wear the uniform. The words landed like stone, and the weight of them pressed the air down until no one dared breathe too loudly. Daniels opened his mouth as if to protest, but Carter placed a sharp hand on his arm to silence him. It was the first time in years anyone had told them, so plainly, that their authority ended where the law began. They had grown used to a system that excused them, colleagues who covered for them, and a society that often looked the other way. But today, they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Marissa paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to sink in. She wasn't interested in humiliating them publicly. Humiliation fades, but dignity lasts. What she wanted was for them, and for everyone watching, to remember this moment as proof that disrespect has consequences and that justice does not bow to arrogance. The prosecutor, clearly unnerved but steadying herself, rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she began, "the charges before the court today involve misconduct, falsification of reports, and excessive use of force during an arrest carried out by Officers Carter and Daniels. As she spoke, the courtroom seemed to come alive again. The case at hand was serious. The two officers were not simply testifying for another matter. They themselves were on trial. Their arrogance toward Marissa had been born from years of dodging accountability, from the belief that uniforms shielded them from justice. Marissa listened carefully, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. She made no reference to what had happened minutes earlier. She did not need to. The lesson was already etched in the air, and the record of the court would hold it in its own way. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney, a sharp, gray-suited man with quick words and little patience, stood to speak. His argument was predictable. The officers were decorated, had served their community for years, and had acted within the scope of duty. He praised their records and painted them as men unfairly targeted by political pressure and media-driven narratives. Marissa listened to him as well, her face unmoving. She had heard arguments like this before countless times. They always sounded the same: praise for service, excuses for misconduct, denial of harm. She let him speak fully because dignity meant allowing even the flimsiest defense its moment. When he sat down, Marissa took a slow breath and leaned forward again. "This court respects all who serve our communities," she began. "But let me remind you, service does not excuse misconduct. A badge is not a shield from accountability. It is a responsibility to uphold it. And today, we are here to determine whether that responsibility was honored or abused." Her words, though calm, carried the weight of centuries, the echoes of ancestors who had fought to be heard, who had endured dismissals, and who had demanded recognition in rooms just like this. At that moment, Marissa caught sight of a young black woman in the gallery, sitting with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked no older than 20, her eyes wide with admiration. That young woman had witnessed the slap. She had also witnessed the rise. And Marissa knew, without saying it aloud, that moments like this plant seeds. Seeds of courage, seeds of possibility, seeds of hope. As the hearing progressed, witnesses were called, testimonies were given, and evidence was presented. But the undercurrent of the room remained. The memory of arrogance met with dignity. The two officers sat rigid, their earlier swagger gone. Their uniforms, once a source of pride and intimidation, now felt like costumes under the steady gaze of the woman they had tried to dismiss. Every time they shifted in their seats, every time they cleared their throats nervously, the courtroom was reminded, respect is not given by rank. Respect is earned by character. When the final witness finished speaking, Marissa called for a recess. The courtroom buzzed with energy as people filed out into the hallway, whispering and exchanging looks. Some shook their heads at the audacity of the officers. Others smiled at the poetic justice of all. Marissa remained behind for a moment, her hands resting on the bench. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of quiet. She wasn't immune to the sting of that slap. She wasn't untouched by the memory of their laughter. But she had chosen, as she had so many times before, to meet humiliation with grace and to let her strength speak louder than their weakness. When the recess ended and the courtroom reconvened, all eyes were once again on her. The officer's fate had not yet been decided, but the moral of the story was already clear to everyone watching. Marissa lifted her gavel again, her voice unwavering. "Let us proceed." And with those words, the trial moved forward, but the memory of what had happened that morning would remain etched into the hearts of all who witnessed it. The courtroom settled again after recess, but the atmosphere had changed. The quiet awe that had filled the room earlier had now transformed into a heavy anticipation, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something historic. People leaned forward in their seats. Attorneys shuffled their notes nervously. Even the bailiff stood straighter, aware that the present was no ordinary hearing. Judge Marissa Johnson adjusted her robe and glanced over her notes. Her eyes, calm and precise, swept across the room, lingering for only a moment on Officers Carter and Daniels. The memory of their earlier arrogance lingered, but she refused to let it distract her. Her duty was bigger than personal insult. She was not there to avenge herself. She was there to represent justice. The prosecutor stood, her voice steady but determined. "Your Honor, we would like to enter into evidence video footage taken during the arrest carried out by Officers Carter and Daniels." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Screens were wheeled in, and the bailiff dimmed the courtroom lights slightly. The footage began to play. The grainy video showed the two officers pulling over a young black man late at night. He looked terrified, his hands trembling as he reached slowly for his identification. The officers' voices were loud, harsh, and dripping with hostility. "Don't move," one shouted, even though the man had done nothing wrong. Within moments, the situation escalated. Officer Daniels shoved the man against the hood of the car, while Officer Carter struck him with unnecessary force. The courtroom gasped collectively. The young man on the screen was compliant, respectful, and pleading, yet he was treated with violence, as though his humanity were invisible. Marissa felt her jaw tighten, but her face remained composed. She had seen this story too many times in too many forms. Yet each time, it pierced her heart anew. The prosecutor continued. This was not an isolated incident. Records show that Officers Carter and Daniels have had multiple complaints filed against them, each dismissed or buried. Tonight, we see with our own eyes what those complaints described. The defense attorney jumped up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. These are isolated circumstances, taken out of context. The officers acted in accordance with the training provided to them." Marissa raised her hand, silencing the room. "Overruled," she said firmly. "The evidence is clear, and this court will not dismiss the truth simply because it is uncomfortable." Her words carried more than authority. They carried history. They carried the voices of countless black families who had begged for someone in power to simply acknowledge what was happening, to say aloud what had long been hidden or denied. The video ended, and the lights returned. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Some people looked angry, others heartbroken, and a few even wiped tears from their eyes. Marissa turned to the officers. "Do you wish to make a statement?" she asked, her tone neutral but steady. Officer Carter shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, his confidence faltered. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly. We were following protocol. We thought he was reaching for something." Marissa's eyes held his. "You thought," she repeated quietly, her voice heavy with meaning. "But your actions were not guided by evidence or reason. They were guided by prejudice. And in this courtroom, assumptions are not justification for abuse." Officer Daniel squirmed, his bravado long gone. He opened his mouth but found no words. The prosecutor stepped forward again. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our next witness, the victim of that arrest, Mr. Jordan Hayes." All eyes turned as a young black man in his 20s walked to the stand. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he raised them to take the oath. But when he sat down and glanced up at Judge Johnson, he saw something in her gaze that steadied him. Dignity. It gave him courage. "Mr. Hayes," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what happened that night in your own words?" Jordan's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. "I was driving home from work. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws. When they pulled me over, I was scared, but I did everything right. I kept my hands where they could see them. I told them I was reaching for my ID, but they didn't care. They treated me like I was dangerous, like I was guilty just for existing." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, undeniable and raw. The defense attorney tried to cut him off with sharp questions, but Jordan remained steady. Every time the lawyer tried to twist his words, Marissa intervened with calm authority. "The witness will answer in his own words," she said, shutting down the tactics meant to silence him. For Jordan, it was the first time he felt protected in a courtroom. The first time his voice wasn't drowned out by procedure or dismissed by authority. When he finished, the room was silent again, not out of disbelief, but out of the undeniable truth of what they had all seen and heard. Marissa leaned forward. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Your testimony is heard. It will not be forgotten." The young man nodded, his eyes glistening, and stepped down from the stand. By now, the gallery was fully invested. Strangers leaned together, whispering about justice. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, and the officers sat pale, their arrogance broken under the crushing weight of truth. Marissa looked across the room, her presence commanding. This court is not only a place where law is applied, it is where dignity must be preserved. And dignity has been denied too often, too long. Her words weren't just directed at the two men before her. They were for everyone. For the young woman in the gallery clutching her notebook. For the elderly man sitting quietly in the back row, his cane leaning against the bench. For the families who had sat in courts like this and walked away unheard. When the day finally adjourned, Marissa struck her gavel once more. The sound thundered across the walls. People began to rise, still whispering about the extraordinary turn of events. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled, feeling as though justice had already taken a step forward. As the officers were escorted out, one of them glanced back at Marissa. The smirk was gone. The arrogance was gone. In its place was the hollow realization that the woman he had dismissed, slapped, even, now held his future in her hands. And Marissa? She didn't even look his way. Her eyes were already forward, fixed on the larger purpose of her role. She wasn't there to fight them. She was there to uphold something bigger. Justice had found its voice in her, and it wasn't done speaking yet. The fourth day of hearings dawned with heavy rain outside the courthouse. Dark clouds gathered, thunder rumbling faintly in the distance, as if the very skies themselves bore witness to the weight of what was about to happen. Inside, however, the room was alive with anticipation. Every seat was taken, and dozens more people stood shoulder to shoulder at the back, eager to see how this extraordinary trial would end. Judge Marissa Johnson entered with her usual calm dignity. The gallery rose to its feet. But this time, their movement carried more than respect for the robe. It carried admiration for the woman wearing it. She sat down, adjusted her robe, and gave a single nod. The day began. The prosecutor started with her final arguments, her voice steady, sharp, and deliberate. Your Honor, and those present here, this case is about more than two officers who abuse their authority. It is about what happens when arrogance replaces duty, when prejudice replaces reason, and when those sworn to protect instead become the ones who harm. The evidence is clear. The footage shows unnecessary violence. The testimonies confirm systemic misconduct. And the officers' own words reveal the truth. They acted not out of fear, but out of bias. The court must act. Justice demands it. The prosecutor's words struck like iron against stone. People in the gallery nodded in agreement, some even whispering in under their breath. Then it was the defense's turn. The attorney stood, his suit immaculate, but his confidence strained. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen present, this case has been blown out of proportion. Officers Carter and Daniels acted within their training. They are not villains. They are men doing their jobs under high-pressure conditions. To paint them as abusers is to ignore the realities of police work, where split-second decisions must be made. Do not let emotion blind you to the truth. His words, though carefully crafted, landed hollow. The gallery remained unmoved. Even he seemed to sense it, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for support that wasn't there. When the arguments concluded, Marissa called the court into recess before the verdict. She returned to her chambers, sitting quietly at her desk. She allowed herself a moment to breathe. The echoes of the trial, the arrogance of the officers, the courage of the victims, the raw pain of the testimonies swirled around her. She thought of her parents, of the many times they told her to rise above insults, to meet ignorance with grace, but never let injustice pass unchallenged. She thought of the young women and men watching her now, silently praying that her voice would affirm their worth. When she returned to the courtroom, the air grew still. Everyone leaned forward as she began to speak. This court has considered the evidence, the testimonies, and the arguments presented. Officers Carter and Daniels, she paused, looking at them directly. You were entrusted with power. That power was meant to protect, not to destroy. Instead of seeing a young man's humanity, you saw a threat where there was none. Instead of upholding dignity, you stripped it away. And when confronted, you chose arrogance over accountability. The officers' faces paled. Carter clenched his jaw. Daniels stared at the floor. Marissa continued, her voice calm but unyielding. This court finds you guilty of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of constitutional rights. The gallery erupted into whispers. Some people gasped, others broke into relieved smiles, and a few quietly wiped tears. The sound of justice, long delayed, was beginning to echo in the room. Marissa raised her gavel. You are hereby stripped of your badges, dismissed from the force, and will face sentencing for your misconduct. This court will not tolerate abuse disguised as duty, nor prejudice disguised as protocol. The gavel struck, once, twice, 3 times. The sound boomed like thunder, final and absolute. The officers slumped in their seats, their once proud posture gone. They were escorted out of the courtroom in silence, not with the respect once afforded to them, but with the solemnity of men who had fallen under the weight of truth. But Marissa wasn't done. She leaned forward, her eyes sweeping across the gallery. Let this day serve as a reminder, she said, her voice carrying strength and tenderness all at once. Justice is not blind to dignity. This courtroom is not a place where power protects itself. It is a place where truth must prevail, no matter how difficult. And today, truth has spoken. The gallery rose to its feet, not by command but by instinct. Applause filled the room, soft at first, then growing louder until it thundered against the walls like the storm outside. People stood with tears in their eyes, clapping not just for the verdict, but for the courage of a woman who embodied justice when others would have silenced her. Among the crowd, Jordan Hayes stood too. For the first time since his arrest, his shoulders were free of the invisible weight he had carried. He caught Marissa's eye and gave a small nod, one filled with gratitude too deep for words. She returned it with a faint smile. Later, as the gallery emptied and the courthouse doors opened to the storm, people spilled into the streets. Journalists rushed to file their stories. Community leaders began speaking of change, and strangers hugged each other with a renewed sense of hope. In her chambers, Marissa sat quietly, the noise fading into the distance. She removed her robe, folded it carefully, and placed it on the chair beside her. Her reflection in the window showed a woman tired but unbroken, tested but triumphant. She knew this was not the end. Injustice would not vanish overnight. But she also knew something had shifted. The officer's arrogance had been met with accountability. The young man's pain had been met with dignity. And the black woman they once mocked, belittled, and slapped had stood tall, not just for herself, but for all who had been silenced before her. Justice had spoken that day, not through vengeance, but through truth. And in the echo of the gavel, the promise of dignity lived on. The courthouse steps were drenched in rain, but no one moved to leave. Crowds huddled beneath umbrellas, reporters jostled with microphones, and the hum of conversation filled the stormy air. For once, the weight pressing down on the city did not come from injustice. It came from hope, heavy and undeniable. Judge Marissa Johnson emerged through the double doors, flanked by court officers who were more protectors than colleagues now. As soon as she appeared, the crowd broke into applause. She had walked into this trial as a black woman underestimated and mocked, and walked out as a symbol of strength. She paused at the top of the steps, not to bask in the moment, but because the people deserved to hear her voice one more time. She raised her hand, and the noise quieted. Justice is not mine alone to carry, she began, her voice steady against the crack of thunder above. It belongs to every person who dares to stand against abuse, every voice that refuses to be silenced, and every heart that refuses to bow to fear. What happened in that courtroom was not just a verdict. It was a reminder that dignity cannot be slapped away, no matter how many times someone tries. The crowd erupted again, but this time it was not chaotic. It was unified, like the roar of a single voice rising against the storm. Marissa stepped down carefully, greeted by dozens of hands reaching out. Some wanted to shake hers. Others wanted to simply touch her robe, as though some of her strength might pass into them. She accepted each with humility. This moment was not about her alone. It was about what her victory meant to the people watching. Among the crowd, Jordan Hayes and his mother waited. When she saw Marissa, Jordan's mother wept openly. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching Marissa's hand. "You didn't just save my son. You gave him his life back." Marissa's eyes softened. "He saved himself by standing in truth. I only held the door open." That night, the city buzzed with headlines. Every news station replayed the footage of the trial. Commentators debated what it meant for law enforcement accountability, for racial justice, and for the courts themselves. Social media was ablaze. Hashtags of Marissa's name, quotes from her verdict, and images of her standing tall in her robe spread like wildfire. But inside her home, away from the cameras, Marissa sat quietly with a cup of tea. The house was silent, save for the patter of rain against the window. She looked at the robe draped over her chair and felt the weight of it. She knew the journey ahead would not be easy. The backlash would come. There would be those who painted her as biased, those who attacked her character, and those who tried to twist the narrative. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that dignity had stood its ground in her courtroom. Weeks later, the consequences of her ruling began to ripple. The police department launched a full-scale internal review. Officers who had once operated with unchecked arrogance now walked carefully, knowing eyes were on them. Community leaders began pushing for reforms with renewed strength, armed with the proof that change was possible. Jordan Hayes returned to school, his record cleared. At first, he was hesitant, haunted by the trauma of the slap and the humiliation of his arrest. But soon, with the support of his family and community, he stood taller. One day, after class, he approached Marissa outside the courthouse. "Your Honor," he said shyly, "I don't know if you remember me." "I remember," Marissa interrupted with a warm smile. "How are you holding up, Jordan?" "I'm better," he admitted. "And I just wanted to say, I think I want to study law. Maybe one day I can do what you did for me, for someone else." Her eyes glistened. In that moment, she saw the full circle of justice, not just in verdicts, but in inspiration. Her strength had planted seeds in others, seeds that would grow into a forest of change. Months passed, and Marissa's story continued to echo. She was invited to speak at universities, to address conferences on law and racial justice, and to mentor young lawyers of color. Each time, she told them the same thing: your dignity is your crown. Never let anyone strip it from you, because it is what gives you the power to fight back. But the most powerful reminder came not in speeches, but in the quiet letters she received. From mothers who had lost sons to police violence. From young women who had been belittled in workplaces. From children who said they wanted to be judges because of her. Each letter was a reminder that her courage had lit a torch, one that others now carried. On the one-year anniversary of the verdict, the city gathered for a march. Not a protest, but a celebration. People carried candles, photographs of loved ones, and banners that read, "Justice lives here." At the front of the march walked Marissa, Jordan, and his mother. As the candles flickered against the night, Marissa felt a deep peace. The road ahead was still long, the work far from over, but for the first time in years, she truly believed that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. The trial had begun with a slap meant to demean her, but it ended with a truth that could never be slapped away. That dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken. That justice, once spoken, cannot be silenced. That a black woman, mocked and belittled, could rise and command the seat of judgment, and in doing so, reshape the very meaning of justice itself. And so, as the crowd's voices rose into the night, Judge Marissa Johnson lifted her head high. She was not just a woman who survived humiliation. She was the woman who turned it into history.